Welcome to HCA Talks Health, brought to you by Health Coaches Academy, the UK's leading health coach training academy. I'm your host, Zena Le Roux, a certified health coach, and each fortnight I'm joined by experts from across the health and well-being space to share insights, ideas, and practical tips you can use to improve your health and everyday well-being. On the show today, we have Dr. Dale Bredesen. He is an international recognized expert in the mechanisms of neurodegenerative disease. His career has been guided by a simple idea that Alzheimer's, as we know it, is not just preventable, but reversible. And his research and discoveries led to the ReCODE Protocol. Some people know it as the Bredesen Protocol, opening the door to new approaches to treatment. I'm very excited about our conversation today, Dr. Bredesen. I think it's such an important topic, and I think perhaps also a misunderstood topic, perhaps. So we'll try to unpack some of the nuance when it comes to brain health and neurodegenerative conditions, but it is such a privilege to have you on the show today. Welcome.
Thank you. Great to be here. Thank you for having me.
You've dedicated your life's work to Alzheimer's disease and brain health. I'm curious around when you first knew that you wanted to work on this topic.
Yeah, I was a freshman at Caltech. I was 18 years old, and I read a book called Machinery of the Brain by Dean Wooldridge. And I got very interested in how the brain functions in comparison to computers and how they function. And I found some of the phenomenology around brain function to be really fascinating. And so I've been studying it ever since then. And it became clear that when you look at brain diseases, things like Alzheimer's and ALS and frontotemporal dementia, Lewy body dementia, and so forth and so on, it is arguably the area of least biochemical therapeutic success. So, as neurologists and as physicians, we have not been successful. As you know, if you go in and the doctor tells you you have Alzheimer's or you have ALS or you have Lewy body disease, it has been for all of my career until recently a death sentence. And so people used to say everybody knows a cancer survivor, no one knows an Alzheimer's survivor. Well, now we know about hundreds and hundreds of them. But when we started out, there were zero. And so I just thought, we really need to understand the fundamental nature. So what goes awry? People have all sorts of theories about what these degenerative diseases represent. It's misfolded proteins, and it's type 3 diabetes, and it's herpes effects, and it's reactive oxygen species, and it's prions, and on and on and on. But none of these theories has ever led to any significant treatment. And so the whole idea of the lab, which I had for 27 years, was to study the basic mechanisms of these diseases with the hope that we could get a different look so that we could actually ask, what is Alzheimer's fundamentally, at its most fundamental nature? What is this all about? And then that would hopefully point us in the right direction to begin to fashion the first effective treatments.
There's many things that come to mind, but firstly, you've mentioned that the treatment for Alzheimer's disease has not been particularly successful.
Right.
Why is that? Why do you find that has been the case?
Well, a couple reasons. Number one, because people haven't understood the fundamental nature. So just what we were just talking about. The idea was, let's get at understanding. If you could, when you're trying to solve a problem, sometimes the most important thing you can do is get the correct frame of reference. If you can, stand in the right place and view it from the right direction in the right way, then you can reduce it to a problem that is more soluble. So what has happened with Alzheimer's and with these other neurodegenerative diseases is that people have tried to use the same old approach that they used for things like pneumococcal pneumonia. So with pneumonia, you have one drug, things like penicillin or erythromycin or streptomycin or things like that. And then you're treating it, and that's good enough because it kills the pathogens and is not too damaging to the host, to us. When you look at Alzheimer's, it's not that simple of a disease. It is a complex chronic illness. So it's fundamentally different.
Mm.
As physicians, we've always gotten away when you have someone with an infection. We've gotten away with just treating the organism, even though there are other things that happen. There may be, diabetes, immunosuppression, there may be alcohol on board, there may be other things that are related to why the person got the infection. But the infection itself, the organism, is so much more important than everything else
Mm.
that if we just target that with an antibiotic, people usually get better.
Mm.
That's not the case when you look at these degenerative conditions. You
Mm.
see that, for example, with Alzheimer's, we know dozens and dozens of things that have turned out to be contributors. So, for example, type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, metabolic syndrome, changes in the oral microbiome, leaky gut, chronic sinusitis, tick-borne illnesses, mycotoxins, mercury, air pollution. I mean, just on and on and on. So the problem is no one of these is the most important thing so that boom, you just get rid of that and everything's fine.
Mm.
And so the medicines have tried to do things like just remove the amyloid or increase the cholinergic tone, the acetylcholine in the brain. And those have a small effect, but they don't really do much in terms of improving people and in terms of giving a long-term positive outcome. So again, looking at this in trying to understand what's driving it has led to much better outcomes than anything else.
And after all these years, I'm sure you have quite an interesting understanding of what drives Alzheimer's disease. And you've mentioned quite a few things now, but what are some of the fundamentals and some of the key mechanisms involved in
Right.
Alzheimer's disease that we need to understand?
Yeah. So we have to back up and look at how did this become? And if you look at evolution, what has happened through evolution is that our nervous systems have had these remarkable evolutions. We can do so much more than other creatures in terms of using our nervous systems. For example, a human can store more than 2,000 home computers of storage in his or her brain, 500 trillion synapses. It's really remarkable.
Yeah.
So in each of these situations, we have evolved for performance over durability. So
Mm.
we have these incredibly performing brains that store lots of neural plasticity, lots of motor modulation, which is what's related to Parkinson's, lots of power amplification, which is what's related to ALS, lots of ability to distinguish many, many different tones and colors, which is what's related to macular degeneration. So in each case, we have these subnetworks of neurons that function together and that give us these unbelievable abilities that humans have. But they are sensitive. They can be damaged over time. And so when you look, for example, let's take Alzheimer's, because we know the most about that one. If you look at that, what you see is there is a supply, this remarkable network, supply and a demand.
Mm.
And when you're young, things are good. You've got lots of good supply, you've got nutrients, you've got hormones, you've got blood flow, oxygenation, all the things it takes to run those 500 trillion synapses. As you've probably heard, 20% of our blood flow goes to our brain, even though our brain only represents about 2% of our body mass. So
Mm.
it's a very, very active area. On the other hand, the demand goes up as you start getting exposed. Now you have to start killing pathogens. In fact, one of the things that's been found in the last several years is that there is a normal brain microbiome. You actually find organisms. I mean, I was taught in
Really?
medical school 50 years ago that, in fact, the brain is, of course, a sterile organ, which is what
Yeah.
we were all taught. It's turned out that it's not quite that simple.
Mm.
There are things, interestingly, a number of these are oral bacteria. So
Wow.
there's interaction. There's also interaction, of course, through the sinuses and then ultimately through into the olfactory nerves and the olfactory bulbs, and then which then will interact with other parts of the brain. So
Mm.
there's actually a lot more interaction, a lot more two-way traffic than people had realized before. And then, of course, there are things that are well known, like the vagus nerve. You've got things going both directions in the vagus, for example.
Mm.
You've got, of course, blood flow. There was a very interesting experiment a few years ago. Everyone's aware of the blood-brain barrier. So the question was, how long can the blood-brain barrier keep out a, a simple organism? And so they actually used Candida, and they did this experiment with rodents, and they simply injected the Candida into the bloodstream and said, can the blood-brain barrier keep the Candida out of the brain for a month, 2 months, 3 months? It turned out to be a couple of minutes.
No.
So things that are supposed to be, not interacting, there's a lot of two-way traffic going on here.
Mm.
So your brain has to respond to these. And one of the most fascinating things that we discovered is that there is a systems biology switch. So, just like you switch from sleep to wakefulness. So there are certain things your body does really well during sleep, like detoxification and healing and things. And then there are certain things your body does really well during wakefulness, like learn new things and stuff like that and move around and all that. So you go back and forth, and that has all sorts of changes in, hormones and in your EEG and so forth and so on. Well, we found that there is another mode switch where you go from connection to protection. So normally you're able to make and store memories, and you're learning new things, you're able to keep that information, etc. However, when your brain has these various insults, toxins, pathogens, reduction in energetic support, all these sorts of things, it literally switches into a different mode, which is protection mode.
Mm.
And you can see it at every level. You can see it in the APP signaling that is associated with amyloid production, in the phosphorylation of tau, in
Mm.
how ApoE4 interacts with DNA. You can see it in the signaling, so-called hippo signaling. You can see it with renin levels. I mean, on and on and on. You can see it in pro-inflammatory, anti-inflammatory, sympathetic drive, parasympathetic drive,
Mm.
on and on and on. And so what is turning out to be Alzheimer's is that you are in this protective mode. You're making the amyloid not to give yourself Alzheimer's. You're making it to fight infections. It is an
Mm.
antimicrobial peptide,
Yeah.
as Professor Robert Moyer and Professor Rudy Tanzi published a number of years ago. This is what the amyloid is doing. And by the way, the same thing happens with the phospho-tau. Again, we associate phospho-tau with Alzheimer's disease. And we should all know not only our blood pressure and our hemoglobin A1C and our lipid panels, we should all know our phospho-tau 217. This is a relatively new blood test. It's a good idea for everyone to know that, to know where you stand. It's essentially a hemoglobin A1C for your brain, telling you, are you on your way to Alzheimer's instead of, are you on your way to diabetes?
Mm.
So what happens is you're literally switching over, and you're changing all of this, and you are bringing these things to bear against these various insults. And
Mm.
so you're in this mode, this protection mode. Now, when we see patients who have cognitive decline, they're all over in this protection mode. So we have to look at all the things that drove that, all the pathogens, all the toxins, et cetera, and drive them back now to the connection mode. We've got to change their signaling. We've got to get rid of the pathogens. We've got to get rid of the stress, and get you back into that parasympathetic mode. And you see these remarkable improvements in people, which we documented in 2 different trials. And there's another confirmatory trial that Dr. Heather Sanderson did, got virtually identical results to what we did. So we're seeing this again and again. In our recent randomized controlled trial, Dr. Stephen Ada, who is the statistician, did a comparison, what's called Cohen's d, which is effect size. In other words, your intervention, how big was the impact of your intervention? And there's a way to calculate that mathematically. And what he showed was that this had the biggest impact. In other words, it was the best outcomes. With the second best published trial, we were 90% more than that one. And then the other ones, we were multiple times as well with the outcomes. So we see that this is the way to get people to turn around, not just to slow their decline, but to improve their cognition. Now, the big issue here is even in the trial, 90% of people improved, but not 100%. 10% didn't improve. We want to understand why that is. Furthermore, the 90% who did improve, some of them improved a little and some of them improved a lot. So how do we get it so that everybody improves a lot? That's what we need to see. We do, however, have documentation now of people improving for over a decade, which is unheard of before. And we've published that about a year and a half ago. So we're seeing things that we've never seen before by looking at this disease in a different way, not as an accident or a mistake or a misfolded protein or something like that, but rather as a response to various insults to your brain that is literally changing the signaling from this connection mode to the protection mode.
If it's a response to insults and the brain goes into protection mode, then there's this very obvious link to the choices we make every single day. I mean, it's not just that. There's also pathogens and things like that. But you know, the choices we make, stress, nutrition, lifestyle. What do you find is the link there?
Yeah, no question. So your brain, again, recognizes these changes. And so it is looking at ongoing inflammation. When we now look at, okay, what are the groups of things that actually will trigger this response? And I should say, the amyloid, one of the fascinating things about this is that it has been shown that amyloid can collect in your brain for 20 years without you having much symptom at all. And you can still do very well. However, of course, it increases your risk for cognitive decline at some point. So on the one hand, you've got this clear increase in risk. Clearly, amyloid is playing some role. On the other hand, it can sit there for years. How do you reconcile those two observations? And so what we now believe is this is a pre-inflammatory mediator. In other words, it's as if you've got a town, let's say, instead of the brain, let's say you take a town, and into that town comes, one not very successful thief, not a big deal. You're not going to shut the whole town down to deal with that. You can put that thief into a jail and just keep it there, and it's not a big deal. However, if you have more and more coming in, now you really have to change to war mode, and you've got to shut the place down.
Yeah.
So what we believe is that you can take this amyloid and you can surround, sequester, and inactivate these various pathogens. And basically, that's what Dr. Tanzi and Dr. Moyer showed a number of years ago. And as long as you don't have a pro-inflammatory state, you don't have too many pathogens around, you can just kind of put them off to the side and everything will be just fine. And you can do very well. However, anything that now drives you into this pro-inflammatory state, and you literally have these anti and pro working together. In Alzheimer's, the pro-inflammatory is on the A beta side, but the anti-inflammatory that's holding it in check is called SAPP alpha. That's a different cleavage. That's, by the way, over on the connection side. So these two are in this dynamic balance. And as long as everything's okay and you don't get too inflammatory, then you can do very, very well. And as you know, people will have autopsies and find a lot of amyloid all the time without people ever have any Alzheimer's disease. So that actually explains that. So basically you have this. Now, the pathogens and the things that are the insults, there are 3 major ones and 3 minor ones, and they're all somewhat related. The first major one is energetic reduction. So mitochondrial dysfunction, reduction in blood flow, sleep apnea, one of the most important contributors, sleep apnea. Anything that reduces that energetic support, sedentary lifestyle, a good example. Insulin resistance, where you're not utilizing glucose as well. Any of those things. The second major one is anything that produces inflammation. And this can be a leaky gut. It can be a change in the oral microbiome. It can be chronic sinusitis. It can be a tick-borne illness, on and on. Any of these things that produce this inflammatory state. And of course, that's been shown to be important in cardiovascular disease, in aging, so-called inflammaging.
Mm.
So the key, though, is to understand it's not just about, oh, you have inflammation, let's get rid of it. We need to understand why. Why do you have inflammation? What's going on there? Then the third big group is toxins. And they are three different types, three different groups within that. Number one is the inorganics. It's the air pollution, it's the mercury, things like that. Number two is it's the organics. It's the formaldehyde. It's the benzene, toluene, anesthetic agents, interestingly. That can be a problem. And then, of course, the one that has popped up recently is microplastics. And unfortunately, we're all exposed to these microplastics.
Yeah.
And we still don't know all the implications of the microplastics.
Mm.
Then the third group, excuse me, I've got laryngitis. I've got 3 grandsons now
Oh,
and 100 viruses.
oh
So
shit.
every time we see them, they've brought a different
Oh
virus to us.
gosh. Oh no.
So unfortunately, we've got some laryngitis. In any case, the third group is biotoxins. So these are the toxins that are made typically by mold species. Things like trichothecenes and ochratoxin A and gliotoxin and things like that. So those are the 3 groups of toxins. So those are the things that are the insults.
Mm.
And then the 3 more minor ones. Number 1, reduction in trophic support. That's growth factors, hormones, and nutrients. Number 2 is reduction in neurotransmitters. So things like acetylcholine, which is critical for memory and reduced in Alzheimer's disease. And then the third one is stress. Too much stress, people definitely have cognitive decline. Let me see if I can do a little better with some water here. Okay, that's better. So those are the big things that are driving this. And again, your body is seeing this and saying, okay, this is my response. So we're just literally we're looking at a part of the immune system that just as
Mm.
your immune system would respond to all sorts of insults,
Mm.
this is one that is part of the innate, that is the early part of the immune system. And as I said earlier, we believe now that it is a pre-inflammatory component before you ever get to the compromise. There's neural compromise when you have the inflammatory part.
Which of these elements do we have control over?
Oh my gosh. So virtually everything. So we look at dozens and dozens of things now, all these different toxins and all these different infections and metabolic status and leaky gut, all this stuff. You have control over almost everyone so that the good news, you can address them. And it starts when we treat people. So we think in terms of 7 basics and 2 specifics.
Okay.
And the 7 basics are diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detox, and some targeted supplements. So we can optimize those various things. And then the 2 specifics are the various toxins and the various infections that I mentioned. So that's what we're looking at. Now, in terms of, what do we control? Before you ever go to the doctor, you can control all sorts of things. You can control your stress level to some extent. And, humans were evolved to handle acute stress with resolution. We
Mm.
were not evolved to handle chronic, unremitting stress, and
Yeah.
that's the problem. We
Mm.
do just fine with acute and resolving stress. What we eat turns out to be surprisingly important. And again, as a neurologist, I was never trained that diet is so important, but I can't ignore the data. So when your brain is functioning and this tremendous amount of power that it needs to function, this to say 20% of your blood supply is going to your brain. And so when you look at this, your brain can burn two different fuels. So it's very much like a Prius. It can burn two different things, use two different things to go. One is glucose and one is ketones.
Yeah.
Now, the problem is many of us lose both of those. So when we see patients with cognitive decline, I consider that a metabolic emergency. These people are not hitting on all cylinders.
Mm.
As we become insulin resistant, and there are over 100 million Americans who are insulin resistant, that means that we're not utilizing glucose as well. And indeed, if you look at a PET scan, the signature of Alzheimer's disease is reduced glucose utilization in the temporal and parietal regions of the brain.
Yeah.
So it actually fits quite well. Now, the problem is when you become insulin resistant, now you're making more insulin because you're relatively resistant to it. With that high insulin level, it prevents your liver from making the ketones. Ketones are just a way for the liver to communicate with the rest of the body and send it energy. So it packages the energy, it turns the energy into ketones, ships it to various parts of the body, including the brain. And then that turns the ketones back into energy within there.
Mm.
And you now utilize that energy. Well, the problem is you can't make them as long as your insulin is high. So you're
Mm.
really hurting yourself. You've got insulin resistance and you've now got no ability or poor ability to make ketones. So what we want to do is return both of those. We want you to become insulin sensitive once again. We want you to be able to go in and out of ketosis. That combination is metabolic flexibility, which is the goal. So there's another control that you have. Exercise, you moving your body, another control that you have. And it's very different. The mechanisms when you do strength training are more about the insulin sensitivity. When you do aerobic training, it's more about blood flow and oxygenation. By the way, it also improves your sleep. So
Mm.
these things have multiple very positive impacts by very different mechanisms.
Mm.
But ultimately, what you are doing is you're taking that mismatch between supply and demand, you're reducing the demand, increasing the supply, and now you're able to make and keep synapses. You are flipping back from protection back to connection.
Mm-hmm. So what you've mentioned about the ketones, that's quite interesting. So even though you might think that you're just going to go on a ketogenic diet, but that in itself will not be enough if you don't improve insulin sensitivity as well alongside
Mhm.
that. Right. So it's
Yeah. So, and this comes back to the fact that when we did our trial at 6 different sites around the country, 4 of the sites got spectacular results and 2 got virtually no results.
mm,
And so what happens is that it really does make a difference if you know how to do this, if you have experience, if you've been trained. And so when you're now getting people to get back to their optimal metabolic status, for those who are frail, you have to take a very different approach than for those who are overweight, for example. The
mm,
ones who are a little overweight are actually easier to get a good result because they
yeah.
have the fat to burn to make the
Oh,
ketones.
yes, yes.
The ones who are frail, you have to be so careful because when you go back and forth and you're feeding and then you're fasting, they will often not do well with the fasting. They just don't have the fat to burn. So therefore, what we do is we start with exogenous ketones
Mm.
just to make sure their brains need that fuel to be able to continue to function optimally.
Okay, so it's quite the detail matters here. It's not that simple, read online, I need to do this or I need to fuel my brain with ketones. If you're frail or maybe don't have a lot of body fat, I guess it's more or less the same situation to be in, that it might not be as effective, and we still need to address the insulin resistance as well with that. I've read some research recently on lactate as well. So the impact that lactate has on the brain, and that it kind of fulfills a similar role compared to ketones. Is that right? Can it also have a
That's
glucose sparing effect?
Yeah, you can that's another one where you can get some function with the lactate. But in general, what we don't want a lot of acidosis associated with the lactate.
Mm,
So in general, what we want is this ability to go from glucose ketones back to ketones as needed.
okay, all right. You mentioned the exercise, and you said specifically strength training, and I think I've seen in the randomized control trial you saying also mentioning sprint or high intensity interval training. Is there a specific reason for that? You've mentioned something on that just
Yeah.
now. Mm.
Just because the data are probably best for HIIT. Now, there are other things as well. I happen to like something called EWOT, exercise with oxygen therapy. This is typically where will either pedal a stationary bicycle, or they will use a cross-country machine, something to generate to generate energy and to use your musculature and generate better blood flow. Then with that, they will take oxygen, and it's typically only for 15 or 20 minutes. They also have a system where you can actually increase the oxygen and then have a slight hypoxia, minimal. You don't want to go too far down on the oxygen because, again, you're dealing with a brain that's already been harmed. And I should say there's a big difference between people who are doing this as prevention versus those who are doing it in treatment. So again, having experience to say, okay, where does this person stand? When you develop Alzheimer's, you go through 4 phases.
Mm.
So phase one is where you are asymptomatic. Already you can pick up changes, which is why I think it's so important for people every 5 years, check your p-tau 217 to see if you're headed for a problem. So
Mm.
that's the pre-symptomatic. We've never seen a person go from pre-symptomatic and do all the right things, get on the protocol, and yet still develop dementia. So it's very, very effective in
Wow.
terms of prevention. The second phase is called SCI, subjective cognitive impairment. On average, that lasts about 10 years. And so these things can start 20s and 30s, very, very young, even though the diagnosis may not be till 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. So SCI by definition means that you know something's not quite right. You're not able to function the way you used to, but you're still doing well enough to score normally on cognitive tests. That's the definition of SCI.
Mm.
Again, virtually all those people do very well. Now, the third phase is called MCI, mild cognitive impairment. And as one patient said, there's nothing mild about it. I mean, it's the third. It's like saying to someone, don't worry, you only have mildly metastatic cancer.
Mm.
It's a relatively late stage of this degenerative process. Nonetheless, many people turn it around. In fact, the group that we did in our trial, those were MCI and early. We did not do SCIs. They're easy to improve. We did with the same thing that's done in the drug trials, which is MCI and early dementia.
Good.
And so again, the majority of those people, if you do the right things, do well. But it's hard. The farther you go, the harder it is to do the further right. This is again why we recommend to everyone, please get in early. If you're over 35, just get evaluated, get on active prevention, and can really make a huge dent in the global burden of dementia. So MCI by definition is now you're scoring abnormally on cognitive tests, but you're still able to do your activities of daily living. You can drive, you can take care of yourself, that sort of thing. Each year, people in that group, about 10 to 15% of those people will now convert to the fourth and final phase, which is dementia. And by definition, that means now you're having trouble with activities of daily living. And of course, ultimately, you can't drive, you can't care for yourself, and unfortunately, that is the last phase. Now, we do see people improve in that fourth phase, but it is more difficult. You have to do more. You've now gone a long way through this, being on the wrong side of that ledger, and so you need to really work at it to get things back to where they were. So those are the 4 phases. And again, treat them differently. So it's much easier for people who are just interested in prevention. You don't need to work as hard. You don't need to worry so much about ketosis. You can do some basics and typically do very well. So I think in the long run, as a public health approach, what we will have is a hierarchical system where everybody does some basics.
Mm.
Most people will do very well and should never get Alzheimer's disease. A small group will now go on and they will break through that. Okay, now we need to do more testing, more treatment. That most of those will do well. Now there will be a very small group so at each phase there will be a smaller and smaller group. Ultimately, for a very few people, you'll have to hospitalize them and look to see why is it that this person is not responding to the basics? Is there some occult infection? You'd be amazed at some of the things that come out of these analyses.
Mm.
Sometimes people will turn out to have an unusual sinusitis. Recently, when one of the patients had a Cryptococcus lawrencii, sinusitis. Sometimes it's going to be, as an example, another person had Lyme disease treated. Everything was good, but for over 10 years later, it turned out that when she'd gotten the Lyme disease, she had a co-infection with Babesia. And, that's well known. The doctor at the time just didn't look for it.
Yeah.
In fact, over 50% of people who develop Lyme do have a co-infection, whether it's Bartonella, Babesia, Ehrlichia, Anaplasma, what have you. And so again, you've got to look, you've got to identify what's going on, and then you have to address those things. And it sometimes is going to take a little more time. But if you do that as a public health approach, you can be quite efficient
Mm.
at having it so that you really reduce the global burden of dementia. And that's the goal.
Mm. It feels like there's a lot to take into consideration. And as you've mentioned earlier, it's not that straightforward. You can't just treat it and it's going to improve. There's so many factors to take into consideration. And that's exactly what you've tried or have done with your ReCODE protocol and the Bredesen protocol. It's about bringing all of these seven and the two elements together, and
Right.
supporting someone who already have mild cognitive impairment or are in the stages of early dementia to not just treat, but even reverse, as you've said. So
Absolutely.
tell me more about, I know there's a lot and you've shared a lot already, but what are some of the latest findings, like the results that you've
Yeah.
seen with the
Yeah.
protocol?
Yeah, and let me just comment on the last thing you mentioned. So this is a precision medicine approach, as you alluded to, and this is exactly what's happened with cancer. So
Mm,
with cancer, you're looking now, there's of course immunotherapy, which is a different approach, but when you look at precision medicine approaches to cancer, you're looking at what is driving the cancer. What
mm,
are the changes genetically and epigenetically that are driving this cancer? And then you are targeting those things. We're doing the same thing with
mm,
Alzheimer's disease. We're looking at what are the drivers, and then we're looking at how do we target each of these drivers. Now, as far as what are the things that are coming out that are latest? I think there are all sorts of interesting stuff happening. First of all, for the trial, I mentioned one of the take homes, which is that some sites do extremely well and other sites don't, and so you really do have to have a functional team that does very well. And if you do that, the vast majority of people will get better. The second thing we saw in the trial is that after 6 months of addressing these various things, you can now add, and this is what Dr. Craig Tanio in Florida did. He was one of the 6 doctors in the trial. He then, after 6 months, added additional things, hyperbaric oxygen, laser, for example, and he saw additional building on top of the improvement that
mm,
he'd already seen, so that he had very, very good outcomes. So what we're seeing is we can continue to get better and better and better outcomes. Another exciting thing we've seen is that people who've improved and stayed improved, even 5, 6, 7 years, are still getting better and better. So as an example, one person who had was down in the kind of 60th percentile. She improved initially, and then she went up to 70th. She then found she had additional things, and as those were addressed, she's now getting better and better. Even though she's now in her 8th year, she's
wow,
continuing to get better scores than she ever has before.
wow.
And so there is this continued improvement over time when you are in that connection mode for a long period of time.
At what age is
So,
that? Sorry, Dale. At what
yeah.
age is that someone can still improve? Any age?
Any age. So
Really?
this particular woman is in her mid 70s now.
Wow.
But we see people improve in their 80s. There are people who've improved in their 90s.
Really?
So yes, there's no question there is more plasticity, as we know from people learning new languages, that when you're younger, it's easier. But nevertheless, we do see people improving into their 70s, 80s, 90s. Again, I think that this old idea that as we age, we're always going to develop some degree of dementia. I think that's an old-fashioned notion. It's turning out to be an antiquated notion. If you understand, again, what's driving this, of course, many people of that age have got problems with toxins and inflammation and things like that, and they don't have the support that they once did. They're not out there exercising the way they once did. They're not getting the oxygenation. Many of them have some sleep apnea, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, well, you just haven't addressed those. Now you address those things, and people will they notice, that they have more energy. They notice that their memories are better. The lady I just mentioned was in her mid 70s. Her granddaughters were there when she was struggling. And then one of them said, "It's kind of crazy how good grandma's memory is. She's gotten so much better."
Yeah.
And we see that sort of thing again and again and again. So it's just about synaptic biochemistry and adjusting these things to make sure that people are doing, are getting the optimal outcomes. Now, again, this doesn't work for every single person. We're trying to understand that. Why is that? Why are there some people where you have to keep pushing and keep pushing? What is going on there?
Mhm.
But as we study more and more, we see things. And I should mention another exciting outcome, and you can see this freely available online. What we're starting to do now is publish just single case studies of adapting this to other things besides just classic Alzheimer's. So
Mm.
one was a patient with PCA, which is posterior cortical atrophy. That's a specific presentation of Alzheimer's that
Mm.
occurs in about 5 to 10% of patients. And it's typically involves visual changes. People will have trouble. They'll sometimes not see the cars next to them until they can crash. They have something unusual called simultanagnosia. They can look at two things, they can only see one of them at a time. They can't see two things at the same time. They'll have trouble reading, for example, interpreting vision. And so a patient with that has done very, very well. She went from not being able to read to being able to read, not being able to use her computer, now able to use her computer again. And she was cared for by Carrie Rutland in New York City. So wonderful to see. It's just wonderful to see these things that just haven't been there before.
Mm.
Another one I mentioned, Dr. Craig Tanio before, was part of our trial. He has a patient with something called corticobasal syndrome, which is a relatively uncommon neurodegenerative syndrome. This person, when he evaluated the person, turned out to have very significant levels of multiple organic toxins. This was from a person who was actually exposed to burn pits in the Middle East.
Yeah.
And this person had already been told by their doctor, "You have corticobasal syndrome. It's over. That's never gotten better. You're going to die." This person turned around, got better. He treated her, and she's done very well.
Wow.
So,
Mm.
we're seeing things that we haven't seen before by looking for the right things and prioritizing the right things.
Mm.
There are now a couple cases of progressive supranuclear palsy. Again, another thing that's a Parkinson's-like syndrome. Again, there's never been success with this before. So as we're understanding the drivers of these diseases better and better, we should be able to do better and better with preventing and reversing them.
Have you ever wondered whether you could turn your interest in health and wellness into a meaningful career? At Health Coaches Academy, we train people just like you to become professional health and wellness coaches through our Level 5 diploma. It's a 12-month part-time course, fully accredited, and designed to give you the skills, confidence, and practical knowledge to help others transform their health while building a career you love. If this sounds like something you'd like to explore, visit healthcoachesacademy.com. Now, back to the show. And unfortunately, I don't know why that narrative has been created, but I think there's really a lot of people out there who believe that there is nothing we can do when it comes to the neurodegenerative conditions, and that the aging brain, it's just going to happen. We can't, at a certain stage, at a certain age, it's part of life. So it's
Yeah.
such a hopeful message that you're sharing, and it's not the case at all.
Yeah.
If we are looking at the right things, you said when we do the right things, then most people can experience this shift. I've seen on the website and on
Actually, it's
the
not wrong.
randomized controlled trial that
Yeah.
there's a 600% stat, showing that it's 600% more effective compared to some of the standard treatment and medicines
Right.
received, or when comparing to people who
Yeah.
are receiving the standard care. Can you
So
tell
that
us
goes
more about?
back to that goes back to these statistics, to the so-called Cohen's D. We
Yeah.
calculated the impact size of different published trials.
Okay.
And as I mentioned, the second best one, we were 90% better than
Yeah.
that one. But
Mm,
other ones that were lesser than that, some were, you're right, 600% better than some of those trials.
mm. Okay. Um, I want to make it really practical. So what does a day maybe look like, or a week in someone's life who is on the protocol in terms of nutrition and movement and all of those things? What does it practically look like?
Yeah, this is a really good point, and I would suggest everyone please take a look at a book called The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. It was such a joy to write that one because I worked with 7 people who all were told, "There's nothing you can do. You've got Alzheimer's. You're going to die." All 7 of them did very, very well. They're all still doing well. And so I asked them, would you write your story of what you do each day and how, what who you interacted with, how did this all came to be, what did the original doctor tell you, et cetera? Because, this is an issue. Doctors will say, just as you said, they'll say, oh, forget it. There's nothing that can be done. And as you can imagine, we've had a lot of pushback.
Mm,
Doctors say, I don't believe it. We publish the results and they say, we can't believe it. Well, I always encourage them, talk to some of the patients.
yeah.
Talk to these people and look at their data. Look at the data we publish. Look at their records. Talk to them, and you can really get an idea. So we usually say, look, it's going to take some of your time, but it's not going to dominate your life.
Yeah.
You're probably going to want to spend somewhere, an hour and a half to 2 hours per day because you want time to exercise.
Okay.
You want time to have the right foods. You want time for good sleeping. So, so let's talk about some basics.
Mm,
So we go back to these 7 basics: diet, exercise, sleep, stress, brain training, detox, and targeted supplements. Okay. So the diet part, we call it Keto Flex 12-3. It is a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. Now, a lot of people will say, well, how can what I eat have anything to do
mm,
with neurodegenerative disease? Come on, that can't be. Well, no, it's actually important. But then they'll say, well, it's not a cure. No, nothing here by itself is a cure.
mm.
This is a network insufficiency that we are addressing. So when you change network dynamics, you don't do it with a hammer at one point. You do it by tweaking. It's just like tuning up a car. You're
Yeah.
changing different things. You're tweaking these things to get each one in line so that your body then says, oh, I no longer need to be in protection mode. I am flipping back to connection mode.
Yeah.
I can make memories. I'm not under tremendous stress. I'm not exposed to tons of pathogens, so forth and so on. So the first thing is, let's start with sleep. So you're going to wake up, you've had sleep. I think everybody should have a wearable, whether you like, Oura Ring, Apple Watch, Fitbit, Garmin, whatever you like, something that will track. And so the goal is 4 parameters on sleep. You want to have at least 7 hours of sleep, at least 90 minutes of REM, at least 60 minutes of deep sleep, and an oxygen saturation, that is SpO2, of at least 94%. So I check mine when I wake up in the morning, see, okay, how did I do last night? And that's the goal. Did I do something wrong?
Mhm.
How can I do better tonight if I didn't do so well? That's the first thing. Now, you then wake up, and as people often will say, you want to set your circadian rhythm. So people often recommend go out, get some sun, make it so that your body recognizes it is daytime. You want to have your circadian set appropriately. And again, all this is written beautifully by, for example, Julie G, who's one of the 7 who wrote the story, just goes through everything in her daily routine. And then there is some flexibility. Some people are really excited about having breakfast. Julie likes to do it differently, and I've taken to do it much more the way she does it, which is to, in the morning, kind of get going, often do some exercise, but then wait to have the first meal. Now, again, there are advantages and disadvantages. Fasting in the morning gives you an advantage of a longer time to develop the ketones. On the other hand, eating first thing in the morning, especially with some protein, that can be pretty good for your glucose curve. And so some people really like to do that. So again, it kind of depends on what you're trying to achieve. So the people who do the best will start with something and then see how it responds to them. So let's say that you get up, you want to have something, you want to have the diet. So the diet here is a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. So we want you to get above 1.0 millimolar beta hydroxybutyrate because that's what works best, at least once per day.
Okay.
And you can cycle out a few times a week. But we like to have, again, we get the best outcomes with a plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet. That has numerous benefits. Number one, you've got enough fiber to help detox. It improves your glycemic control. It improves your lipid control. It improves your gut microbiome. So there are many mechanisms by which this helps. So that's the first thing. So you want to have high plants. You got high plant polyphenols. You're going to improve, again, you're going to improve your gut microbiome, have prebiotics and probiotics. And then you're going to get enough protein. Typically, we are using about 70% of calories are coming from, about 70% are coming from good fats, things like, polyunsaturates, omega-3s, things like that. And then more like 20% are coming from protein, and then more like 10% from carbs. And we want to avoid simple carbs. So, and then I would say the diet that we use is very similar to the one that Dr. Mark Hyman likes to use as well. And that is, again, a very kind of similar approach where he's using things like, eggs and berries and greens. You want to have a lot of vegetables. You want to have a good protein, so pastured eggs, wild-caught fish, grass-fed beef, pastured chicken. All those things are wonderful and can be very, very helpful. You want to stay away from the high mercury fish, so you want to have something like that in the morning. And then some people like to do 2 meals a day. Now, Julie is an OMAD, 1 meal a day. She sometimes does two, but often does one. I've switched over to being a 2MAD, 2 meals a day. But again, for younger people, you probably want to do 3 meals a day. It's been shown that snacking is not such a great idea. It does reset your motor complex function in your gut. So it has that disadvantage. You want to basically have your meal, digest your meal, get back into that rest and digest, the vagal tone, the parasympathetic drive to get the best outcomes. And so that sort of plant-rich, mildly ketogenic diet is what's done well. And then you want to find out, what is my fasting insulin? You want your fasting insulin to be 2, 3, 4, 5, not 10, 11, 12, 15. We've seen them over 30. That's insulin resistance. So you want to see them down in the 2, 3, 4, 5 range. And you want your HOMA-IR, which is telling you if you have insulin resistance, to be around 1.0. You don't want it to be up 2, 3, 4, again, telling you insulin resistance. You want your hemoglobin A1C to be down 4.9, 5.0. Once you hit 5.7, that's pre-diabetes. And once you get up to 6.4, then that's full-on diabetes. And that really does increase your risk for cognitive decline. And then you want to have some time for exercise. And you may have seen these KATSU bands or restriction bands. And especially for people like me, I'm in my mid-70s now. These are ones that you can actually get some really good results using these restriction bands. It's essentially more bang for your buck. I mentioned EWOT earlier, another great way to get good oxygenation and blood flow. You mentioned HIIT, another good way. But you do definitely want to get some for strength because that improves your insulin sensitivity. You then also want to get some aerobics or some HIIT, which is going to give you more blood flow, more oxygenation, and even better sleep and things like that. Improved lung volumes, everything works better. Improved cardiovascular status, all of those things. And then stress, stress, as a scientist, I used to think stress like, come on, we're all under stress. So
Yeah.
what? But as I mentioned earlier, it really is about, is it acute and resolving stress? Or is this now stress that is chronic and unremitting, which is really damaging? You can literally follow the molecular pathways associated with stress in the brain, and they intertwine with Alzheimer's disease. You
Mm.
see with the stress, you see increases in amyloid, increases in
Imagine.
phospho-tau.
Mm.
So you need to address that as well. And, again, we all have some degree of stress, but managing it. One of the things I find very helpful is just to take some couple times a day and do some, slow breathing for a minute. And you can literally, I check my heart rate variability on my watch, and you can see it bounce up from, 50 to 110, just with that. It'll come back down after a while, but at least you've had that time for improvement. There's so many good things for that. People love, great music, so-called forest bathing, Shinrin Yoku,
Mm.
anything that you like. My wife and I were just out today. One of my favorite walks is along the water in Tiburon, California. Just beautiful. So after we were at lunch together, I said, let's just head out to Tiburon. Had a beautiful walk there, and then came back later today and had a great hike up here in Northern California. So there are just so many great ways to get that stress down and to try to minimize things so that your brain simply functions better, as everybody knows.
And
So
it's
that's,
not.
diet,
Mm.
exercise, sleep, stress. Then detox. So then there's brain training. So brain stimulation. So now it's a little bit like working out with weights. Once you've got the nutrition, once you've got the support, now you can work out with weights. The last thing you want to do is work out with weights when you're malnourished. That's just going to
Mm.
break down your muscles. You have to have something to build them up again. So now that you've done these basics, now add some brain stimulation. And brain training is a really good one. Professor Mike Mersnick, one of my favorite professors from UCSF, is the godfather of brain training, started with brain training years ago and has done very well. And they've shown repeatedly that it has benefits. But then also things like photobiomodulation,
Mm.
especially with the gamma frequency, which is driving the brain and supporting the brain. So that's another form of stimulation. So some people like to use, some magnetic stimulation, some like a microcurrent. There are all sorts of ways to do that. There's laser is another one that I mentioned earlier. All these things can be helpful.
Was it
And then
binaural
deep
beats that you've mentioned? Is it binaural beats, the gamma waves?
So yeah, so that's another way that
Yeah.
drives your brain. Yeah, so that's
Oh,
another
okay.
form of
Mm.
stimulation. Exactly right. So yeah, some people like to use binaural beats, and there's a Dr. Kat Toops who was the clinical leader on our two trials, and the principal investigator. She really likes something called Auragen, Auragen. It combines the photobiomodulation with sound, and you kind of get the best of both worlds. And she's had very good results with her patients with that. So again, lots of wonderful things to do there. And then, detox and targeted supplements are the six and seven. And detox, there's so much basic. There was a famous study out of Finland showing that people who did regular sauna had a much lower likelihood of developing dementia than
Oh,
people who did not do regular sauna.
okay.
So you think about it, it's fascinating to me. Your body is constantly pushing outward all these things that are coming in. So
Yeah.
you're inhaling this, but then you're trying to breathe these things out. You are detoxing through your urine, through your stool, through your sweat, through your breath. All of these things, you are getting rid of these things, and you are also sequestering and metabolizing them. So you have to be careful. One of the things that happens is when people are overwhelmed with these, they'll literally stick them into their organs. So then it happens as you get older, these things are starting to come out. And as an example, around the time of menopause, you have what's called the osteoclastic burst, which lasts about 7 years. So some of these toxins that have been stored and not hurting you in your bones are re-released into the
Oh,
circulation.
gosh.
So right around that time, we see a big burst of cognitive decline in some people. And we recognize, oh, okay, we need to look at their toxic burden. We need to help them to detox. And with detox, you can't go too fast. You can't go too slow. You can't be overly aggressive because you're dragging this stuff out again. So you have to get the right tempo for each person. As Dr. Neil Nathan has pointed out as a real world expert, the more toxic you are, the slower you have to go. You just gotta, you can't, overexpose people.
Mm.
So that's another thing. And so that has to do with clean water, getting enough of that. It has to do with high fiber diets. If you need, then there are binding agents that you can actually do to sop up these toxins. Some of the mycotoxins, for example, things that were developed by Dr. Richie Shoemaker, very, very helpful. Things like Welchol and cholestyramine and bentonite clay. These are things that he used for his patients who had mycotoxin exposure with really good results. He likes cholestyramine is the one that he typically uses, which not everybody likes, but there are multiple ways to do that.
Mm.
And then I mentioned the sweating. Get into the sauna, get some sweat going with some exercise,
Mm.
and then you can use some non-toxic soap like Castile soap, for example, and get rid of this stuff. And it's surprising. There was a study done a few years ago looking at what's actually in sweat and looking at the toxin levels in the sweat versus in the blood. And in fact, one of the things they found was cadmium much, much higher in the sweat than it was in the
Mm.
blood.
Oh God.
So it is a way to get rid of certain things. So using all these mechanisms, your body is dealing with these, and we don't even think about it for most of our lives.
Mm.
But
Mm.
having some regular detox can be very, very helpful. And then
Mm.
lastly, the targeted supplements. And the great news is, and again, the naysayers will say supplements aren't a cure for Alzheimer's. Of course they aren't. We're not saying that they are.
Mm.
But to not use the armament, part of your armamentarium that can be very important and very helpful, why would you not help somebody? You're
Mm.
doing these other things. Let's make sure that you optimize the whole system. You'll get the best results, and that's what's been shown again and again.
Mm.
So there are things like SPMs, which are quite good for resolving. These are the resolvins that were discovered at Harvard by Dr. Charles Sirhan. And there are, the omega-3s, which are their cousins, vitamin D, the urolithin A to support your mitochondria. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of these things. Improving your cholinergic neurotransmission with things like alpha GPC or like acetylcholine. Some really nice work out of MIT from Dr. Wortman over the years showing improvements in increase in synapses in his studies when he combined omega-3s with DHA, which
Mm.
is or with DHA was the omega-3 with acetylcholine. So that combination very helpful. And so just on and on. There are so many of these parameters that can be enhanced if you kind of know what are the arrows in your quiver that you can use to deal with these various things. So again, understanding it for each person, which is why it's personalized, and
Mm.
seeing who's going to need this versus who's going to need that, is where you can really help people a lot.
These habits seem like good habits for anyone, right? It's not just for people who wants to improve their brain health or their cognitive function, but it's about reducing inflammation in the system, getting proper sleep, high fiber, mildly ketogenic diet, being conscious of the carbs and the sugars and the processed foods, in order to be as insulin sensitive as possible,
Yeah,
and getting a good sweat from our movement, setting that circadian rhythm in the morning, but also managing our
yeah,
stress in healthy ways. And as you've said, it's not that we're not supposed to go into the sympathetic system at all, but it's about not getting stuck there and moving back to the parasympathetic, back into rest and recovery. And then the um, more specific things around supplements and the toxins and all of those things that should also be taken into consideration. How long
exactly.
should someone do this? How long have you seen on the in the trials that you've done? How long before someone can see results?
Yeah. So typically what I tell people is get things optimized, work with your practitioner to get them in the team. and then give it 6 months. Once you've gotten things, you have to remember this has been going on. When people have symptoms, this has been going on for years. The underlying process, typically about 20 years when your symptoms are showing up.
Yeah.
So it's not going to change overnight, but give it several months. In our trial, we saw improvements at 3 months, more improvement at 6 months, more improvement at 9 months. So you could just see people getting better, better, better. And then there were a few people where they finished the trial because it was a 9 month trial, but then we saw they continued and they got even better at
Even
12
better.
months. So
Wow.
it does take some time. Now, it depends a lot on what's causing the problem. So again, that's why I say it's important to understand for each person what is the problem here. But as you said, ultimately it's about good health. We
Mm.
see, I mean, what's fascinating to me is this has kind of come full circle. We started by trying to understand what's driving neurodegenerative disease, but it brought us into understanding brain span, health span, lifespan, and good health, and evolutionary mismatch. We're doing things that we just weren't designed to do.
Yeah.
So, so optimize these things, give yourself some time, and then keep at it. And it's going to be, as I say, it's going to be different for each person, and you're going to have to figure. Now, what I see again and again, when someone comes in and it's mostly metabolic, because years ago I wrote a paper on here are these different subtypes. We see mostly inflammatory Alzheimer's in some people, mostly atrophic in some, mostly toxic in some, mostly vascular in some, and they look different. So when I see someone where it's mostly metabolic and some inflammatory, those people are easy to improve. They do well. If they do the right things, the inflammation goes down. We try to understand what's causing it and try to get rid of that. And the metabolism improves. Their insulin sensitivity comes back. They're able to get into some ketosis, or we give them exogenous ketones. And wow, their brains are suddenly, they're turned on again. That's easy. It's the toxic ones that are really tough. So we see others where they come in and they've just got severe. You look at their toxin load and it's just way, and
Mm.
you know it's going to take years to remove these things, and you're going to have to be careful and remove them not too quickly.
Mm.
So it depends a lot on what's driving it, how
Yeah.
quickly do you catch it, how far along are they, do they do the right things? This is where it's really helpful to go back to get feedback. You need to do the right thing, go back to your practitioner, readjust. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, health coaches play possibly the most important role of
Yes.
all
Mm.
because they're with them. They're telling them, here's what you have. Okay, you did this. And the difference between a really effective health coach and an ineffective health coach is the difference between success and failure.
Yeah. It's that huge.
Yeah,
Is it necessary for participants to follow the protocol 100% of the time to see the results?
absolutely not. No, and this is the same thing that Dean Ornish found with cardiovascular disease 30 years ago. There is a threshold again. So we're looking at, supply and demand.
Mm.
So the problem is there's no simple way to measure when did you make it? When did you get there? So we just have to kind of keep at it until people start improving. But yes, you can imagine there are people that come in like this, and it's going to take a lot. You got to really drop the demand and really increase the supply. There are other people that are just right there, and it's just
Mhm.
simple. You get boom, they do
Yeah.
so much better. And so it really does depend. And for most people, if they do kind of two-thirds of things, if they do, do the best you can. There's some workarounds if you can't do some of the things. Don't do any of the things that are really horrible. Don't go out and expose yourself to, the California fires, for example, the people that were in the middle of those, that increased their risk for cognitive decline. That's just no
Imagine.
question.
Yeah.
So do
Mm.
the right things to the extent you can, and people typically do quite well.
But that brings us back to the health coaches, and you've just shared that very interesting stats around that, where if it's not so much about not knowing always what it is that we should do, although I think in many cases with Alzheimer's, people don't have a clue that the lifestyle
Yeah.
can be connected to the results. But the other part of it is following through and doing these things, because I think there are many people out there who wants to get in a proper training session and choose the right foods, but it's not always that easy to do. So helping someone through that as a coach has a really big impact.
And I think one of the things that I see a lot is the coaches that are able to say, look, you've got a lot of things you could do, but let's do the most important ones first, and let's
Mm,
get you a program that's workable for you. So
mm,
good health coaches are really good psychologists, and they
mm,
can see who, needs more incentive, who
mm,
needs a little more push, who needs some time off, who needs to focus on one thing or another. And again, working with the doctors to figure out, okay, this person is really more toxic. Let's focus more on the things we can do. Here's a person that's more vascular. We typically, for the ones who are vascular, include the so-called vascular triad, which is nitric oxide, arterosil, and nattokinase. And that is working very well for many people. For the people then more metabolic, we really want to focus on their basic metabolism and then look to see how are they doing with their insulin sensitivity.
mm,
So figuring that out and then working with them to say, how do we get you doing the right things without being overwhelmed and giving up?
mm.
That really makes a difference.
It's much more individualized.
It
And
is.
also it's a multi-model, but also multi-discipline approach with all these
Yeah.
different health professionals supporting someone to
Yeah.
improve their brain health.
One of the things that really helps is when people start noticing an improvement. Then suddenly oh, wait a minute, I get it. This is really helping. And so what I see is the first thing that happens is they stop the decline and things now stabilize. The second thing is they'll notice little things. Oh, wait a minute. So often the spouse will tell me, they did something yesterday they haven't done in several years.
Mm,
And then you start to see after that, so it's the stopping the decline, and then it's small improvements, and then it's big improvements. And so just getting some positive feedback really helps.
think it must be extremely fulfilling, Dr. Bredesen, from your side to know that you've put this together and that people can experience that some people can stop and even reverse cognitive decline, what it means for their families and for themselves and their quality of life, I think is it's quite fulfilling, right?
It's been, the thing that I've really enjoyed the most, which is why I wrote the book, The First Survivors of Alzheimer's. It's been just great to talk to people who said, "Wow!" And one of the people, Deborah, was one of the first ones I talked to, and she said, "I have a second life now." She has now started. She changed her career. She started a nonprofit. She did some more learning, and she's back doing something completely new and different, and loving it. And it's just great. And also, she said, "Look." Because she had some genetic risk, and she said, "Look, my children, I was worried about my children. I no longer have to worry about my children."
Mm,
So that part has been great. Balanced with that, however, is the fact that there are still people where they start and they just don't respond, and we try to understand what. I have to say, it's the horrible thing is watching people decline. Now, it used to be that everybody declined. So it's great to see that that doesn't have to happen anymore.
mm,
But it's always, always difficult to have someone declining despite the best efforts.
mm. I can imagine, yeah. But still, I mean, from going from not having an answer to starting to understand some of the elements and seeing some improvement is huge. Thinking about the difference between people who have mild cognitive impairment or early dementia and someone who just wants to prevent this from happening or protect their brain
Yeah.
health as much as possible. You said there's a bit of a spectrum here, so you don't have to do as much perhaps, but these basic habits or these foundational things still apply to most people, I guess.
Yes, absolutely. So for someone, for example, who's interested in prevention, there, again, I would check your p-tau, make sure you're not, because we do see people, I've had people before say, you know what, it's in my family. I think I'm okay, but I'm here for prevention.
Mm,
And you look and like, wait a minute, no, you already have
maybe.
MCI. In
Mm,
fact, we had a case, we have weekly rounds. We had a case just today where the guy came in and said, I'm here for prevention. And you looked at his studies. No, you're not here for prevention. You have very significant MCI, and you just,
okay.
it kind of,
Wow.
it kind of crept up on you.
Mm,
And so, but okay, I'm glad you came in now instead of when you had dementia.
yeah.
dementia. So there's a lot we can do. Now, you don't have to be as strict about the diet. You don't have to get yourself into ketosis every day.
Mm.
Just make sure that you have some insulin sensitivity.
Mm.
Diet, exercise, sleep, stress, and some form of stimulation would be helpful.
Mm.
And, detox, you can wait and see if you have cognitive decline. The key is anytime if you start having any decline, don't wait. One of the biggest problems is doctors will tell the patients, oh, you're just getting a little older. This is normal. We had someone the other day, this person was already well into dementia, and the neurologist told him, no, what you have is just normal aging. No, absolutely not.
That's,
And so we have to quit thinking that this is part of normal life. There's so much more that can be done now. So the bottom line is much less you have to do for prevention. Once you have significant symptoms, so once you're into that SCI phase, then you want to get on it. Again, I always tell people when you see a patient who has cognitive decline, only one of two things will happen. Either you will make them better or they will die. So it's very important. Get in there and find out what's driving this. The good news is if they have SCI, virtually 100% of those people can get better. Tune up their metabolics, make sure they don't have major toxins, those sorts of things. They're going to do great, and they should do great for the rest of their lives. And they really shouldn't come off it completely. The very first patient I treated, patient zero, April of 2012. This is Judy. You can see her online at judywalks.org.
yeah,
And she walked she's now 82. I treated her when she was 67. She's still
yeah,
doing well.
yeah.
But when she started, after several months, she went off and she had problems within about 2 weeks after she went off. So, she was improving her supply, reducing her demand. And when she stopped doing that, things changed.
Yeah.
And so she's continued to optimize things, and she's now, 14 years into this and doing very, very well. She
Wow.
walked 2,700 miles from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic Ocean. Uh,
Gosh.
uh, yeah, last year, 2025. This year, she is going to walk from Land's End to London in England. So she's amazing.
At the
She
age of
is
82, did you say? 82.
when she's 82.
Oh
Yeah,
my gosh. Wow. It's
yeah.
inspiring.
She is. She is inspiring. Yeah, she really is.
What do you recommend we do if someone goes to their neurologist and they say, oh, it's just signs of aging? Where do we go then? Because going to your doctor might not be the right fit then. Is it more about, yeah, tell us, what should we do?
Well, so what you want to do is find a doctor. There'll be someone out there who's taken the course and encourage people. We have a wonderful online course. You can go just look up ReCODE 2.0 training, and you can do that. We have some fantastic world experts. Dr. Anne Hathaway, Dr. Neil Nathan, I mentioned earlier, real world expert on mycotoxins and tick-borne illnesses. We've Dr. Chris Shade, who's interested in toxins and is a real expert on that. Dr. Cyrus Raji, who's a professor of neuroradiology, talking about the MRIs and what you can do with those. So, really fantastic course and really fantastic group of people. So, I would encourage people to do that. And then, what the health coaches in general have found is that they find a doctor that does understand this and that you can interact with and refer
Yeah.
them, and then you can work as a team
Yes.
with them to get the best outcomes. There will always be naysayers. There will always be doctors who say, I don't want to learn anything new. I want to hold on to the past. And I think that's just the history of medicine.
Yeah, it is.
Mhm.
Is the ReCode 2.0 program also available to coaches
Yeah, it's available to all practitioners.
or practitioners? Fantastic.
Yeah,
I've also seen that you've recently written a book, The Ageless Brain.
right.
Is this more for prevention? If someone's
This is
interested
for
in
everyone. Yeah.
for
So,
everyone.
so the
Okay.
idea was the first three were really about Alzheimer's and what to do, but we realized that just as you said earlier, these are about good health, and we realized that everybody should avoid. So the idea of this is to make it so that everyone can have a brain span that is as long as their lifespan.
Mm.
People who live till 88, 90, but their brains only work until they're 70 or 75. That's a real problem. And
Mm,
so what we want to do is make sure that everybody has a brain span that's as long as their lifespan. And so it is about all the things you can check, all the things you can do, the places you can go, and again, emphasizing get in early. So it is more on the prevention side than the other books that were more about the reversal side. But
mm,
it's also about, where do things stand? So I'm actually just starting the next book, which is The End of Alzheimer's, which was published back in 2017. We're
mm.
now going to be 10 years since that. And it's now available in 33 languages, and over a
Brilliant.
million copies around the world have been read. And so the idea is, okay, a lot has happened in 10 years. Let's make sure that everything is really up to date, and all of the peptides that have come out and have been used, and the various nutrients that have come on, and the various stimulation, and the randomized controlled trials. What have they shown us? What have we learned? How do we get the best outcomes? What is associated with the worst outcomes? All of these sorts of things that are absolutely critical.
Mm. Seems like you are relentless in a really good way.
There's a lot to
About this
do, as you
topic.
know.
Yeah, yeah, it's good. And I think there's so many things for our listeners to take away from today's conversation. But before we end off, just to point them in the right direction so they can go to your website if they need more info. Is that the best place to go to?
Yeah, probably the best place to go. You can go to drbredesen.com is one way to go. I work with a group from Silicon Valley, and the group that used to work with Apple. This is Lance Kelly and his team of Apollo Health.
Mm,
So we have the ReCODE 2.0 training. I would recommend you can get a free cognitive test. Just go to mycqtest.com,
mm,
and CQ is for cognitive quotient. So mycqtest.com. If you want to have your blood biomarkers, you can go to get a brain scan. Now, that would be mostly in the US. So there are going to be other places in South Africa, for example, that you can
mm.
get your p-tau checked. So I think the important thing for people to realize is that all of us can help to reduce the global burden of dementia. Whether you're a health coach, whether you're a neuropsychologist, whether you're a family caregiver, whether you are a concerned spouse, whether you're doing it for yourself, whatever, there's so much now that can be done that we can all have an impact. And my gosh, as you were saying earlier, I mean, the idea of taking someone who would have ended up in a nursing home
Oh,
and having to have a normal life, I mean, it makes a huge, huge difference.
yeah, such a, I think quite a meaningful impact to have on people out there. If there's one last thing that you maybe want to leave our listeners with today, what would that be?
That would be that throughout history, there have been scourges. So at one time, everybody worried about leprosy. At one time, people worried about syphilis. At one time, people worried about polio. That was a big one. I was a little boy in the way back in the 1950s. Polio was a big worry for people. People don't wake up worrying about polio. And then,
No.
of course, in the 80s and 90s, it was huge about everybody worried about HIV. It is not the scourge it once was. And then, of course, COVID. Uh, what I see happening is that Alzheimer's is becoming a former scourge. And my hope is that in the upcoming years, we will not worry about this. We won't wake up worrying about dementia. That has been the biggest fear of my generation. I've told our daughters, who are now in their 30s, look, you guys are the first generation that does not have to worry about this, because there's plenty you can do to prevent it and even reverse it. You know not to wait, start early. So I think that's the final thing for people to know. This is going to be a passing scourge if we all do the right things.
Mm, thank you. Thank you so much for joining us today. I think it's such an exciting but also a hopeful topic. And it's really something that I want to shout from the rooftops. I feel like everyone should know this, that it's not Alzheimer's is not simply something that may perhaps happen to some of us one day because of bad
Yeah,
luck or because of genetics. But there's this hopeful message that there's so much that we can do and that lifestyle plays a huge role. And we actually have so much
absolutely.
more influence than we realize.
Absolutely. Yeah, this should be, we can all make this a much less common problem. And so we need for people to understand this. And to a little pushback on these antiquated methods of just saying nothing can be done, nothing can be done, when there is, in fact, so much that can be done.
Yeah. And thank you so much for dedicating your life, sharing this important message with people out there and giving people hope and empowering them to stay sharp as they age. And
Thanks, Sina.
yeah, as health coaches, let's help people turn that knowledge into action. We know there's so much that can be done, but that change is not always that easy. People face barriers, there's challenges, there's deeply held beliefs, as we've discussed today, that can make taking action quite difficult. So, as coaches, our role is really to uncover those obstacles, to support people through them, and also empower them to make choices that support their long-term brain health. So thanks again, Dale. Thanks for taking this time to share your message with us. And thank you for our listeners for joining us. We'll catch you next time. Thank you for listening. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please feel free to share it with friends or family who might find it inspiring. And if you'd like more insights like this sent directly to your inbox, make sure to sign up for our fortnightly HCA Talks Health newsletter. We've popped the link in the show notes. See you next time.